We're using the deployment of a photosynthetically active radiation sensor as an example for building a primary data product. Now, the idea for planning for primary data products that are independent of the analysis that you're going to do later is that you can start that data product when you're planning to go in the field to go collect the data. So let's imagine that we're thinking about how to build a pipeline that we're going to use for these data even before we've deployed the instrument. So I'm going to go ahead and get this pipeline started. Again, I'm just going to put it on my desktop, but you can put it in your file system wherever it's convenient. I'm going to create a new folder that I'm going to call PAR for photosynthetically active radiation deployment. Let me get this on the right monitor. So I've got an empty folder for my pipeline, and really the folder that I want to start on in this case is I'm thinking about what am I going to do? What am I going to do out in the field? How am I going to plan for it? What's going to be generating the data? So I can create a new folder in my pipeline. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the protocol first. So I have my protocol folder. And I'm not even worried about code yet because at this point I'm thinking about manually what do I have to do to go get these data. So in that case, part of my protocol might be keeping track of manual efforts. And in this case, there's going to be a manual effort associated with going in the field. So I'm going to create a subdirectory called field in protocol. So the idea of a pipeline is that you always have those four folders, the input, protocol, incremental, and product in your pipeline. But once you go into one of these folders, you can structure subdirectories, files, any way that you want that makes sense for whatever the workflow is. So in this case, I have a big part of my protocol that's tied to the field. I want to keep the files associated with the field protocol together. So I'm going to create a subdirectory or a folder called field in the protocol folder. So one of the things that you probably want to do if you're going in the field is set up some sort of checklist for everything that you want to do and the equipment you need to take with you. I'm not going to type this checklist out, but I've got a copy of a checklist here that might be applicable for this particular effort. And I've just made it as a Word document. Makes it convenient for having a nicely formatted document for keeping track of my checklist. If I open up that Word document, it looks something like this. Right now I'm in web view. I can also go to page view. But for these types of things, I find web view is a little more convenient because I don't really see the need for having page breaks when I'm never going to be looking at this document on paper. So I have different headings here. And I can turn on navigation if I go to view, navigation pane. I can jump around with my headings here. This makes a quick way to jump around my checklist. And I try to imagine all the things that I need to do in terms of doing a deployment. Now, this isn't an exhaustive example of everything we might do with this particular equipment, but it's stuff that's relative to the data management. So I've got a laboratory prep phase. This is the stuff I need to do in the lab before I go out in the field. Then one of the things I need to do in the lab before I go in the field is pack the equipment. I've got everything ready to go that I need for doing the deployment. So here's a field equipment list for doing that. Then there's some things I need to do in the field to get everything ready. Here are the things I need to do for instrument deployment. Then once it's been deployed for a while, I'm going to go back in the field, recover the instrument. I'm going to download the data, and ultimately I'm going to do some sort of data processing. So I call this a checklist, but this is really the protocol. This is the protocol, the field protocol that I am going to perform in order to get data from this instrument at a particular location at a field site. So there's the types of things that you're going to do for a laboratory preparation. You need to make sure your batteries are charged. You need to make sure you're wired up to the PAR. The PAR transducer is wired to your data logger. Make sure that you have the serial numbers. This is really important metadata to make sure you know which equipment you used. We want to program the data logger with the appropriate calibration constant for the PAR transducer. So here's a place where we can start putting stuff in our pipeline to keep track of our field protocol. if we are going to program our data logger, then we probably want a copy of that program. And we might think of the copy of the program as part of the input to our pipeline. So if we go back to our pipeline, I have my protocol folder. I want to start putting content in an input folder. I need to create it. So 1_input. I'm going to refresh this so it sorts it in alphabetical order. Now I have a blank input folder. And say I have programmed my data logger in the lab and it's all ready to go. I made sure it's doing what it's supposed to. I can create a folder here to make sure I have a copy of the program that was used as part of the input to this data product. So I have a folder for a data logger program. And here I have a copy of the program that was used for the example data we're going to be working with. This is with a Campbell CR300. Now these Campbell CR300, these are called CR basic programs, and these are just text files. So if I bring this up in a text editor, I'm going to use Notepad++. That's my favorite coding text editor. And this is what a Campbell program looks like. I'm not going to go into the details of how these programs work, but an important detail for making sure you're using the right program for the right power sensor is this number right here. This is the calibration constant for getting from a voltage that you measure on the power sensor to an estimate of the actual power flux, the flux of electrons tied to photosynthetically active radiation. I'm sorry, the flux of photons tied to photosynthetically active radiation. So you need to make sure that this correct number for whatever power sensor that you're using, in this case we're using UWQ9225, that's the Australian number, and we put this all in the comments of the Campbell program to make sure we keep track of that. These are the things that you want to make sure you have a record of. Okay, so we have put a copy of our program, so we know what program was used for this particular deployment in our input directory. Let's go back to our checklist for our protocol, and it is even here. It's telling us we want to save a copy of the data logger program. So our checklist is reminding us of what we need to do to build our data product. So it's really important that you build thoughtfulness about building data products into your protocols. Not just something that you assume you'll do, something that you say, this is part of my checklist. I need to do this every time. So now we've got a field equipment list. I'm not going to read through all of this. This is just some of the things that you're probably really going to need if you're going to deploy a sensor the way that we deployed it for the sample data we're going to use. There's some field prep that you might do, and there's some instrument deployment that you might do. Some steps for these two things. Certainly metadata is important. You want to have in your checklist that you make sure you're getting the right metadata, so record the time and conditions of the deployment. Again, thoughtfulness about data management in your protocols, in your checklists. And also, if it's possible, which you usually can, go ahead and launch the data logger, have it collect some data and make sure the data makes sense relative to when you're deploying the data and the conditions when you're deploying it, and go ahead and download that data and make sure it looks right. Again, we can save some test data in the equipment test input folder in order to keep track of that particular step. So if you're out in the field and you've run a test on the program, then you maybe are going to have a folder maybe called equipment test. Now I don't have an example of an equipment test file here, but I do have this folder description. Sometimes if I intentionally leave a directory empty, I will pop a file like this in here just to make sure that people know that I'm intentionally leaving it empty. And I've just put a quick description in here in HTML form. So if I double click on it, it'll pop up in a web browser. And it's just a quick HTML file that says this folder should contain the results of the pre-deployment equipment test. So perhaps I'm getting this pipeline together and ready before I go in the field. This might be just a little reminder of what goes in that folder when I'm executing my field protocol. Also, in my field protocol folder, in my Campbell program, recall I had a specific calibration constant I needed to use for a specific PAR sensor, or for a specific serial number for a PAR sensor. Perhaps I want to keep track with every data product, the documentation of which calibration coefficients go with which field sensors, or which PAR sensors. So if I go to, I have a file for that, and I can copy and paste that file, and I'm just going to put it right next to my checklist here, because it might be part of my protocol. Paste. There we go. So I have this file called LICOR Quantum Calib PDF, and what's in this PDF file are some scans that come with my PAR sensors. I have 3 of them in my lab. And these come with all of the calibration constants that you need to use depending on how you are configuring the device. So it never hurts to have things like that directly with your data products. So again, you have a full documentation of the context of the deployment, including make sure you've got the right calibration constant for the right serial number in the sensor. Okay, let's go back to our checklist. Then we get to instrument recovery, where we record the time and conditions of the recovery. Again, be thoughtful about the metadata you need to collect when you're building checklists in your protocols. And then we can do a data download, where we're going to download data to the data logger download input folder. So again, I'm specifically thinking about my pipeline with my protocol to make sure that I'm putting things in the right place relative to my protocol. So the idea of that, oops, went too far back, is I need to go to my input, and I need to have a folder called Data Logger Downloads. And I can have this folder, again, set up ahead of time before I've even deployed the equipment, just to make sure that folder is ready to go. So when I go in the field, I can use the software from Campbell to download the data into that folder. Finally, one other input that I might have here is throughout all of this checklist so far, you've seen several references to taking down information, metadata about the deployment. Now, there's lots of different ways that you might keep track of that. You can have basically a field notebook where you're using your checklist to tell you what to write down in that notebook, which is really important to make sure you follow your checklist to make sure you capture all the data. In which case you might have in your input some sort of way to keep track of your field notes. So if you have a field notebook, you can take all of your notes, and then you can scan those notes or take photos of those notes with a cell phone and put those into this folder. So you have all the field notes tied to a particular deployment with the data product, and you keep that together with the data that you download from the data logger later. Alternatively, if you have a really well-defined protocol that you want to make sure you do the same every time, you might not just have a field notebook, but you might have field sheets, pre-prepared sheets with particular blanks for particular metadata that you want to make sure you collect every time. And you can have those sheets that you know you're going to fill out electronically using a laptop computer in the field, or if that's not going to be feasible with a computer, you might have these field sheets printed out on Write in the Rain paper. Then you can take those notes and then scan those notes, and then later on digitize that information into spreadsheets or into the files that you use as input to your workflow. But ultimately, you want to capture, however you do it, you want to capture your field notes somehow, and you want to have a place in your input for capturing that metadata for later use. So that's just a quick review of how you might go ahead and set up your pipeline before you even go in the field, in terms of having your field protocol alongside your data product in your protocol folder, along with any information you need for executing that protocol. And as part of that protocol, you're going to start gathering some information in terms of the data logger program that you're probably going to have before you go in the field, because you're going to want to make sure that program is working before you go in the field. So we can go ahead and stick that program in this folder. But even for the things you don't have yet, like the downloads, you want to go ahead and create folders for those, the equipment test folder and the field notes folder, just to make sure they're all ready to go and ready to collect data as you are moving through your field protocol and the protocol for recovering the instrument later.